Here we are again. It's a bit cold, birds are everywhere, so the lake's kind of lapping behind me. Look, today I'm going to try to define something which is very difficult to define, but it's a word that everybody seems to be using currently, and that's the word freedom. F-R-E-E-D-O-N, freedom. I think freedom must be the most misunderstood word in the English language, and obviously in almost every other language on the planet since time immemorial. So what's freedom? Does it mean independence? Does it mean independent action? Does it mean doing what you like? It seems that the world has taken on board the word freedom as a reaction to the current lockdowns around the world. It seems to be a phrase that's been used more and more often. And it's an exceptionally difficult phrase to use, because obviously freedom in a capitalist society or any other society, freedom of action is determined by a number of things. The first and the most important is the consequences your freedom of action have on other people. That's exceptionally important, because it's not as if we are independent units who can do whatever we like whenever we like. All actions have consequences, and if those consequences are totally related to yourself, well then freedom of action is the reasonable prospect, or a reasonable way to look at things. But when freedom of action has consequences on other people, especially negative consequences, then we need to understand that there are limits. For example, I don't have the freedom of action to go around shooting anybody I don't like. There are consequences, not just for myself, but obviously for the people whose life you take. So obviously I think there'd be no dispute regarding freedom of action in that situation. Then you have freedom in terms of independence, and independence to a significant degree in a capitalist society is dependent on disposable income. And the more disposable income you have at your fingertips, the greater freedom of action you have. You've got the freedom to stop work, you've got the freedom to go on holidays, you've got the freedom to buy things. But if you don't actually have those resources, that disposable income, you may not even have the freedom to buy food or access shelter. To a significant degree, the freedom we are able to exercise is determined by the consequences to those around us and by our ability to exercise that independence through access to disposable income. Let's take this a step further. Now, obviously, people want the freedom to die with dignity, the freedom to end their own life, the freedom not to undergo surgical and medical procedures which, for whatever reason, they don't want to pursue. But again, in all those situations, there are consequences. If you have a perforated bowel and you decide not to have an operation, you will die of septicemia. That's the consequence. If you decide not to have certain vaccinations for various reasons, well, the consequences are a little bit greater than individual consequences. They're not just consequences regarding you, but they're consequences regarding your family, your friends, the people around you, the people you work with, and society as a whole. So there is a difference. There is a difference. Now, obviously, people have fought and died in the struggle for freedom for generations, since time immemorial. So if you want to look at freedom, we need to break it up into two components: freedom to and freedom from. Now, the struggle freedom to is limited by the consequences that the exercising of those freedoms cause. Obviously, the freedom to bear arms has the consequences of people using arms not just to protect their liberty, but to settle scores, to create chaos in a particular society. The freedom not to be educated does have consequences. But again, there are individual consequences. Now, in our society, we make a very important division between when you can exercise certain freedoms, which are usually based on an age, like the freedom to vote, the freedom to drive, the freedom to have a shooter's license, and the list goes on and on. Now, I don't have the freedom to practice as an architect because I haven't done the necessary training. And obviously, if I pass myself off as an architect or a doctor or a chiropractor or a dentist, and although I may believe that I have that freedom to do that, there are major consequences because I don't actually have learnt the skills to ensure that I practice that particular profession or trade in a particular way. And that's why we have training programs, people receive certificates, and that gives them a basic competency in a particular field. I mean, I don't have the freedom to walk into a aircraft control tower and take over, or get on board a ship and try to steer that ship, or drive a plane, or fly a plane, because again, I don't have those skills. And I think we all accept that, because the consequences of denying people that freedom to do particular things without the necessary training to ensure they don't cause unnecessary harm to the people they're involved with, we all accept that. So when I said before, you break up freedoms, freedom to and freedom from. Now, the struggle for freedom from is the type of struggle that public interest before corporate interest is exceptionally heavily involved in. Because the struggle for freedom from hunger, freedom from insecurity, freedom to have secure accommodation, freedom to access the necessary medical care, freedom to access education. These are all important freedoms that we struggle for, because these freedoms have an impact on significant proportions of population. It's not just an individual choice. I mean, if you wish to end your own life through euthanasia, there are various states in Australia which have now passed legislation which give you that right. You have the right to refuse medical treatment. But again, these are individual choices, and they're limited by your capacity to make that decision. But these are individual choices, and the impact is basically on you, not anybody else. But the struggle for freedom from hunger and freedom to live in a secure environment and freedom not to be enslaved, or the freedom to leave a difficult situation, are all general freedoms which you can pass legislation to ensure it occurs. Now, every society, whether it's a sovereign nation state or a club, has principles of association or a constitution. And those principles of association and constitution outline what can and cannot happen in that particular club or association or sovereign nation state or region. So principles of association are fundamental in any human organisation. Now, obviously, although you may think you have the freedom to own other human beings, whether it's financial, whether it's out slavery, the fact is, and for the last few hundred years, such behaviour is unacceptable in most societies, because people understand that freedom is based on the fact that you are controlling other people's freedoms. You are denying other people the ability to live an independent life. Now, public interest before corporate interest has always been interested in the concept of a universal basic income. Because in a capitalist society, as I said at the beginning, freedom, to a significant degree, what you can and cannot do, is determined by your access to disposable income. Many people find themselves in an unacceptable situation but cannot leave because of financial constraints. A universal basic income would ensure that people would have that possibility. Freedom from being abused, freedom from being racially vilified, freedom from being vilified because of your abilities, freedom to be able to live your life in a secure environment, the freedom to have a roof over your head, the freedom to have access to education, the freedom to have access to medical care. These are all important freedoms, which some people have in some societies and others don't. And that struggle, freedom from, is the struggle to ensure that every human being has access to these basic freedoms. As far as independent action is concerned, individual independent action, it is ultimately determined by the impact we have on other people. If we pursue so-called freedoms which have negative impacts on other people, if we pursue those freedoms, well, then they're not freedoms. And the difference between those people who are calling for freedom today and those people who call for freedom is very simple. It's that difference of what impact does your independent action have on the people around you? Does your independent action curtail their freedom? As I said at the beginning, if I went around shooting people dead, obviously, not only are there consequences for myself, but there are consequences for everybody I shot dead, because any freedoms they may have had, they are now not able to exercise in any way. Now obviously, this call for freedom as far as the lockdowns are concerned is based on the fact that people are concerned about the impact that it's having on them and society as a whole. But again, to a significant degree, it's a balancing act. Is the harm caused by a lockdown greater than the harm which we caused by a pandemic? When it comes to individuals who do not want to be vaccinated for whatever reason, whether it's philosophical, political, religious, it may not even be rational, could be totally irrational. The fact is that unless you are working in areas where your refusal to be vaccinated has a negative impact on people. So if you're in a healthcare industry, if you're in education, to name two, the fact is that you shouldn't be working in those fields because your presence causes harm to other people. In terms of mandatory vaccinations in society as a whole, the great thing about vaccination is that as the numbers increase, that small percentage, that 5% of the population that don't want to be vaccinated, are protected by the creation of what's described as herd immunity. So in many regards, every person who has decided to be vaccinated is not only protecting themselves and their family and the people around them, their workmates, people in society as a whole, and they're also protecting that small section of the population that which for whatever reason does not want to be vaccinated. And that's the issue that we currently face. So to say that somebody who doesn't want a vaccination is a freedom fighter is totally ridiculous. What they basically want is independent action for themselves, irrespective of the harm that independent action may do to somebody else. So think about it. Freedom. Freedom to, freedom from. Freedom, independent action. Independent action is limited by the effects we have on other people through that independent action. If every time I wanted to punch somebody and I went and punched them, well obviously I don't have the freedom to punch somebody or shoot somebody dead or cause them harm. But I do have a moral and ethical responsibility to be involved in struggles which ensure that people have freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom of association, and the list goes on and on. So it is a difficult concept. It's an easy word to say. It's a difficult concept to define and talk about. But if you think about freedom to and freedom from, independent action based on disposable income, it'll give you some guidelines in assessing what people mean when they talk about freedom.